few weeks back, I got the brilliant idea to turn Super Mario Galaxy's Castle Gardens into a racetrack for Mario Kart 8 Deluxe. Well, it was a brilliant idea back then. Now it's turned into some curse preventing me from uploading videos. Which is pretty much what happened with all of the track revamps. It started off very enjoyable, and stayed that way up until a point, because of a little thing called bake maps. A process that I didn't even know existed just months ago, but now has me ensnared in a torrent of tedious tasks and frustrating waiting games. Yeah, lighting. The engine handles that, right? There's no way you have to No, yeah, you have to do that, like 6,000 individual times. I may never be done generating the lighting for this track. It's my torch to burn. I'm like that blacksmith guy in Elden Ring. But I might as well tell you how I ended up here while I wait for some bake maps to render. It was a really cool process getting here, so let's go back to the beginning. While looking for some Mario Kart 8 modding ideas, I came across Super Mario Galaxy's starting area, and immediately saw the opportunity for a track, which could run from the gate over here, through the city alongside the water, swing by the castle, and up over this river into a forest, then up the hill to the top of the plateau, and back down to the gate. You might notice that there isn't a forest, or a path, or anything past where the pathway ends near the castle, which is unsurprisingly the hard part. Going from a cool idea to cool looking geometry that might also function as a decent track. But before modeling anything new, I started by updating a bunch of the textures, mostly replacing them with look-alike textures from Mario Kart 8 or other contemporary Wii U and Switch games, like Mario Odyssey. That definitely did a lot to improve the visual quality of the base model that we're working with, mostly because these new textures have layers to them beyond just the image, those being specular and normal maps, which make them look shiny and bumpy respectively. That way you can have a part of a texture indent or be raised, and you can have part of a texture be shiny, like a brick face, while the space between the bricks reflects less light and is rougher. Now that we had a better looking model, I could start carving out a pathway, turning the path left up the hill, making a bridge over the river, creating a pathway to drive on, winding it down the mountain, and covering the forest area with forest stuff. Mostly using assets from Super Mario Galaxy to keep it familiar feeling. This was not perfect, but parts of it looked really good. The parts that Nintendo made that I didn't have anything to do with. Like the forest looks pretty good, but the pathway definitely doesn't, and the final section of this track is probably the worst Mario Kart track idea that anybody's ever thought of. And I didn't just think about it, I actually sat there and modeled this thing with the intention of adding it into the game. So we're gonna fix some things. And to make things a lot easier, you guys left a ton of complaints, which is something that you usually wouldn't want to get, but is actually super helpful for a project like this. Because, I don't know how to say this, but I don't play Mario Kart. Yeah, I played like weird stuff that almost none of it's even Nintendo related, but making Mario Kart tracks is such a perfect way to do the type of modeling that I like, and I've always loved Mario Kart's tracks and scenery. So when I do something completely incomprehensible like place wooden fence directly on both sides of the already narrow track, just know that I genuinely didn't think that was an issue. So we've got a list of plans now. The first of which being those fences. They gotta go. I'll still place some fences, but they shouldn't serve to keep you on the road. They should just be there to keep you in the track area. So I started placing them along the river over here to open things up a bit more. But after stupidly placing a whole bunch of these fence pieces by hand, I realized that there doesn't really even need to be a fence along the river, since the river itself will be hazard enough to keep you on the track. Unless you just really want to drive in the river, I'm not going to stop you. But we will put fence pieces anywhere that you might be able to drive off into some weird area or fall back to an earlier part of the track and accidentally make negative progress. I also had to do a little bit of work to the terrain in some areas. I tried using the sculpting tool here, but it kind of just felt like I had less control over the shape of the ledge than I would by just selecting vertices, lines, and faces. I'm sure there are plenty of cases where the sculpting interface is far better than dealing with the mesh the old-fashioned way, but in the case of a relatively low poly model like this, I think the old-fashioned way is perfectly reasonable. Well, now we've got a good bit of this forest's outskirts fenced off. I guess I could go without fences entirely, since I'll be setting the track boundaries anyways, so Lakitu will pick you up if you stray too far off the track. But the fences are also going to serve as a visual indicator of when something that might look like a pathway or shortcut is actually just a wall. Then I headed over to the river. I want the horizon of this river not to just drop off the edge of the world, so instead I made it turn around to bend and out of sight. Back over at the hill, I want this fencing to run up the left side across this gap all the way up the plateau, but that's going to take a really long time doing it by hand. So instead I made a curve for an array of the fence pieces to follow. I seriously don't know why I insist on placing so many things the tedious way when you could just do this way. With this system, I can increment the face pieces by just ticking up a number, and they'll follow along a line that I can make easy adjustments to. I might as well do the right fence this way too. That way it can just be one single piece running all the way up the plateau. So now that we figured that out, let's talk about my plan for this last section. I obviously want to get rid of the double zigzag 180 section, which I think I'll replace with a glide ramp, which is actually just your guys' plan that you suggested that I'm taking credit for. But actually, that old plan that you guys came up with sucks compared to my new plan, which this time I'm stealing from the Gaming Wizard, who sent in a seriously great suggestion by video. He posed the idea to split the track at the top of the hill and have a left path take a glider over the valley and then circle back down to the track, while the right path goes underground to a 0G crystal cave section which does something similar, but like at a weird angle and in a cave. This is a pretty ambitious plan, but I can tell it's the best thing I can do to make this course more interesting and playable. But we'll get to making these alternate pathways after we polish things up a little bit more, like getting the dirt path to be less blocky and getting it to sit on top of the grass more evenly, and making the forest area into more of a shortcut by turning the crystal over and turning it into a ramp. Just outside the forest, back near the castle, this turn needs some serious work. It's just too sharp and blind, and certainly not intuitive. So let's make it a little more like this. But I'll need to expand the cliff out a bit to give us room to work with, which unfortunately caused some issues because I had proportional editing on, so it screwed the flags up pretty bad. But I'll just delete those since I won't be needing them with this new layout, which will be created by replanting the grass texture over the old path and paving the dirt texture where I want a new path. This is the general shape of the path, but it's going to take some heavy altering to look acceptable. I'll start by duplicating some of these small trees over to this grassy area to give it a little more tree-ishness. Then I'll clean up this awful geometry that the path is made out of by deleting it, filling a face where it used to be, and triangulating the new face. After that, I spent a frustrating hour getting the mesh in decent shape, only to find that I had completely messed up the little castle wall at this section's entrance. Whoops. So I went ahead and replaced that toasted castle wall with a fresh new old one from a previous backup of the project. Then I set up the dirt edge texture along the new castle turn. Now that this new turn is looking better, I want to change this second bridge. It'd be a lot cooler if this was a ramp instead. So I made a couple of ramp pieces out of cubes with the castle brick texture. Well, I feel like the earlier sections of this track are a lot better now. I guess we can get to work on that glider path. The first component to this path is an observatory building that you'll drive into and glide out of. I started with the same building model that's used just across the street with some heavy modifications, including a telescope on the roof aiming up to the sky. This should work, but now we need somewhere to land. I figured the easiest way to find out where exactly this turn should start is to make a cube and extend it straight down to the cliffside, like a tape measure. That way it's not going to be way off to the left or right. Then I made a very rough version of this turn down to the track. I'm not going to put a second into making this look nice until I actually know that it works the way it is. And you know, while I'm over here at the beginning of the track, I should widen the cobblestone path too, like I did with the rest of the track. And I'll just go ahead and delete these flowers that I accidentally screwed up since I don't feel like fixing them, and they almost certainly won't look good in game anyways. Well, now it's time to make the 0G cave path. This is going to be a pretty interesting process. The first step is to cut a hole in the ground where I want the entrance, and make a fairly large box underground, which will be the interior of the cave. This box needs to connect to the top entrance, as well as an exit at the bottom of the cliffside. And it needs to be big enough to fit the 0G path, but not poke through the ground anywhere. So I went ahead and shaped a path that twists down into the ground and does a 180 out towards the exit. And just like the glider section, I don't want to decorate this until I race on it and know that it works and is a good design, which I guess is our next step to test the track out in game. Now, getting this model turned into a working enough Mario Kart 8 Deluxe track isn't super easy. I'm gonna have to address my completely unorganized object hierarchy and get that boiled down to only what's necessary. So we'll have to sort out all of the hidden geometry and unused textures and anything that an earlier version of me shrugged off for later, cause now is later, and I'm now the guy that's gotta clean up after that scumbag. Then, after everything's been sorted out and we only have what's going into the game, I've got to make a collision model, since what we've made so far is just what's going to be visually rendered. So basically, all of this work has gone into a pretty model to sit above us while we do some subterranean skydiving. But making a collision model isn't so bad. You just duplicate your model and simplify it to the utmost degree of gameplay functionality. Get rid of anything that your cart won't collide with, and color code different materials that should behave in different ways. Is it a wall that you crash into, or a drivable road? Off-road or on-road? Water, dirt, grass, stone, crystals, these things should all have separate materials. Now that both of these models are ready, we can export them. Then we can open Track Studio and create a new project using the main visual model, which should go ahead and crash Track Studio. Dang it. Luckily though, I've gone through this before and knew the first thing to check. And sure enough, there was a list of color attributes on our model which seems to have caused the issues when importing. So I got rid of those, and everything imports just fine now. But this kitchen floor aesthetic isn't gonna cut it. We need some textures. So I'll import all of these texture images and get them assigned to the right formats. And importing the collision map is a very similar process. But the material part is more interesting since you get to assign each material its own physical properties. Now that we've been through the model and collision menus, we need to head to the last of the three main menus we'll be using, the map editor. This is where you set up game events and rules. So I'll set the start point right here before the gate and go ahead and fix the skybox. You can also change the skybox here, so I'll just set it to something more fitting. Hopefully I find something better later, since the game doesn't really have any great Starry Night skyboxes, but I'll just go with this. Alright, the lap paths are next. These are those course boundaries I was talking about earlier, which also serve as checkpoints for respawns and to verify that you race the entire course when giving you a lap. I'm just gonna set up the path for the 0G section right now. I'll branch the path over to the glider section once I get the 0G path figured out. And for the 0G to work, I need to set up gravity paths. Now I can save the model, collision, and map files, which are placed in a mod folder with a file path and file names that match the ones that I'm looking to replace in Hyrule Circuit. The reason I'm replacing Hyrule Circuit specifically is because, as a couple of you guys suggested, it would be the easiest way to replace coins in the track with star bits, since Hyrule Circuit has rupees that replace the coins. That way I don't have to make the whole game use star bits by replacing them in this track. Well, let's test it out. Hey, it didn't crash. That's kind of a miracle. But the track's definitely a little bit big. In fact, I can't even make the river jump, and I just end up falling out of the map and getting respawned at the very beginning because the checkpoints aren't working. Also, the flags are on drugs and everything has way too much bloom. So I went ahead and touched on some things that were kinda janky and scaled both of the models down by 20%. I also selected the bumps on this hill section up to the plateau and gave them a trickable road material. That way you can actually trick off of them. Then I re-exported and re-imported, and now you can see why changing the size of the model can be a real pain, because now I've got to refit the lap points to the new model's position and scale, which I can do mostly by just moving and scaling the whole lap path, but it's still going to need a little bit of manual tweaking as well. And just like that, the game crashes when launching the track, which was because when I scaled the model down, the start point ended up in some weird spot underground, which usually wouldn't crash the game, but I guess it doesn't matter since it would have been underground anyways if it didn't crash. Well, now that that's fixed and the track is a better size, I think we're good. Good enough to still need to do a bunch more work because you still can't make it over the river. And now I'm stuck down here because it has collision now, and doesn't trigger Lakitu. Oh, but luckily I can glitch through this invisible fence over here and get back in the race. The lap paths are not working right, the flags are still on drugs, and Mario is doing Michael Jackson stuff. This should have been the moment that I knew that this would take over a month to finish, but somehow I optimistically thought I'd hammer this thing out in a couple weeks. So I went over to Blender and instead of scaling the whole track down again, I just made the ramp gap smaller. I also fixed this ground wall over here which caused Mario to get stuck at a weird angle. It's generally a good idea to make sure that you don't have any surfaces that flatly sit facing the sky be tagged as walls, since you can't drive off of them if you land on them. Back in Track Studio, I realized that the flags don't have their textures assigned, which is probably the issue there. And testing things out, I'm now able to jump right over the river no problem, and uncover the horrors of how awfully glitchy and ugly the forest is. And probably worse is the cave, which has no 0G. That's not to say it has gravity, just 00G. Double OG. It's also got a wall for a floor, just like we had in the town section. Let's try and fix that 0G. I'm sure watching through Squadaloo's tutorial will refresh my memory on how these things are supposed to work. And as it turns out, I forgot you can actually just generate gravity paths in the same place as the lap paths, and then delete the ones you don't need. That way they're perfectly aligned. Then you can generate gravity camera paths from those, which is something that I didn't even have. So I did that and tested the track, which ended up bringing some bad news. Apparently, you can't make it over the river just fine if you don't use a mushroom boost, so I'll need to fix that. Also, the 0G still doesn't work. But my cat chimed in on the matter with a possible solution.
What? Do you know what's wrong with the gravity paths?
And sure enough, that fixed it. I also set up the game's water material on the lake and river, so those should look good now. Whatever I did to fix the gravity paths also fixed the checkpoints. Actually, it kinda made them work too well, since Lakitu now just carries you through the whole course. That's because I set the lap points too high, so being on the ground is considered being out of bounds. So I made the river jump easier and brought down the lap points. And now, the bridge still isn't close enough, and neither is the crystal ramp. And that stupid turn at the top of the plateau is super unsatisfying and lame, and the 0G road only has one turn, then it's just a straightaway. But the laps count, so that's good. But you can also drive up on the side of the grass on the edge of the track because it's way too pronounced. I know the solution to all of these problems, but they each have 20 or 30 small steps, and they might need to be redone several times to dial things in. Who knows how much changing I'll need to do to the 0G path to make it somewhat fun, and I might end up re-importing the model 4 or 5 times to get the plateau turn just right. And there's a few different ways I can go about fixing the grass ledges, but this is the exact kind of thinking that I try to avoid. I'll enjoy each of these processes. It's just the idea of all of them that sounds unbearable. So let's move the ramps a little bit closer. I can also make this shallow river section crossable by making the far side of it more gradual and assigning a new drivable water material to it. And you can cross the river now, but it doesn't quite work the way that I thought it would. The river jump works fine now though, which is what really matters. I think I've pretty much assessed everything gameplay-wise that I need to in order to make some bigger changes to the model. So I took some notes and started with the grass edges, raising the path up to them, and then going in and adjusting things by hand, or by mouse, or cursor or whatever. The only thing that really sucks about working on things now is that I need to go in and update the collision map with the exact same changes anytime I do anything. And the only way to have it match exactly is to delete the old mesh, copy the new one from the visual model, and then switch the materials to the right collision material. But now, in-game, this flush grass is much nicer, but the start area still feels a little bit rough. So I made this grass thing into a trickable ramp. Then I adjusted the grass by the hill jumps and the crystal in the forest. I also moved the castle gate out of the way to open things up a bit more. And I enhanced the shallow river a little bit by putting a few rocks in it, and placing a separate higher water plane above the dirt riverbed, as well as making the ramp out of the river trickable. Now this river shortcut is a really cool lead into the castle shortcut. That way you can pull off a shortcut combo if you have the means to. And now that I've adjusted it a bit, the plateau turn is actually really fun now. This is suddenly becoming quite an enjoyable track to race on, but I think it could use a little more danger. So I got rid of the fence along the hill down to the town. And back at the beginning, I made things even cleaner by smoothing out the drop from this ledge and turning the ramp circle into a single piece. But when I re-import the model, the materials were all screwed up. I'm not sure entirely why this was happening. It was pretty frustrating, but I got it working and ended up just racing on the track for a good 10 minutes because it's actually pretty fun now. The glaring issue here is the 0G section, and the glider section, which doesn't even exist yet, but we'll deal with that later. Unfortunately, I think the best way forward with this 0G path is just to delete it and make a new one. We can keep the cave box though, it's not like we're starting all over. This new path will start similarly, but it'll swing out to the left and then back to the right again, giving you more time to drift instead of just driving in a straight line. And now that we have the shape of the path, we can place some cubes where we want the cave to conform to it. I was able to make some walls on the sides of this path by adjusting the shape that this curve is extruding. It's not super clean since it makes these weird holes on the ends, but the actual visible raceable part looks great. Now I can tweak the shape of the cave box to make it look more natural. I tried making some different features like crevices, but pretty much everything just looked bad. But eventually I got some crystals down and made a tunnel that winds back out of sight. And I put down the dirt texture on the floor, which made me think of a certain texture I had made back in the earlier videos. It is a cliff texture, but I think I can extract the crystals and merge that texture with the dirt texture. And yeah, this should work. Now we can go through and really detail this cave. I probably could have added some scaffolding or something. That would have been a good idea. But I think this overall turned out good. Now I've just got to make sure the cave doesn't stick out of the ground anywhere, and sew the cave and cliff together, which made this thing?
What is that? What the heck is that?
I also made a few other changes around the track, including outright deleting the crystal ramp since it makes the most sense to just have it be a shortcut that you boost through. Then I re-imported and all of the materials messed up again. So I just said screw it and completely restarted the Track Studio project to hopefully knock some sense into it. And one of the benefits to redoing all of the Track Studio stuff is that this time around I can set up the lap paths in a sensible way. And after doing all of that, the track does indeed launch just fine. But the dirt path is super shiny and doesn't seem to exist properly in some areas, which is weird because it's absolutely there on the collision map. Also, you might have noticed that I'm on lap 1 out of 0, which is not good. Eventually I did get the checkpoints working properly, so after falling out of the map, Lakitu now brings me along the path, which shows us that all of this stuff up here has no collision. I messed around with some more numbers and checkboxes and fixed the whole lap 1 out of 0 thing, but that doesn't matter since I can't complete a lap with the plateau not having any collision. But why just the plateau? Why is it only confined to this higher area of the track? Well, that thought got me thinking. I might have the whole track way too high up. If it's too low, you get issues. I've dealt with that before, so I bet there's some kind of ceiling thing or something. No. That didn't fix it. So I asked the Track Studio Discord server for help, and as always, they pulled through. It turns out my collision model has about 95,000 triangles, which is a little bit too high. Apparently, something like 50,000 is a safe maximum, meaning I've got to cut the collision model's polygon count in half. Luckily though, I was a complete 0 IQ numbskull about how I made this model, so there was literally an entire castle just sitting there not doing anything. And each of these trees is 500 triangles, when I could make them out of a cylinder for just 60 triangles. Also, the fences should all just be flat planes. I got rid of some of the grass that was sitting out of bounds, and was able to get rid of the bottom side of the glider turn. The bottom of that turn alone was 6,000 triangles that I don't need to worry about anymore. And I was able to shave some more geometry off of the cave path, about 3,000 triangles worth. After that, I went ahead and got all the trees swapped for cylinders and the fences replaced with planes. And what do you know it? The collision map works again. And the 0G section is more varied, in the same way a 12-car pileup is varied. This sucks, but it should be salvageable. Also, I flew through the grass right here, and I don't know why, and probably never will. I made some adjustments to the cave path, and made a pit in place of the pillar at the bend. That way it'll open things up a bit more, and you're not just staring at a wall and floor the whole time you're doing this turn. Well, the new path is too steep, you literally fall off of it, but it's getting close. So I went ahead and made it worse. Then I tried a different approach by making it better instead, but it's still a little off. At this point, I'm pretty much just putting puzzle pieces in a box and shaking it around and hoping it's solved when I look inside. Well, I can at least widen this final path section and make this tunnel a bit wider, which was definitely needed. After some experimenting, I began to realize that the left swing needs to be more prominent and smooth. So I made a pretty big change there and tested it out. And there we have it. The cave path works, and it's actually really nice now. After that, I did some good old adjusting the dirt path to match the grass, which was pretty much something that I did between each and every step of the way. I also made an actual hill behind the forest hill turn so it isn't just a weird glitchy ledge. And I made the hill on the way up to the plateau conform to the pathway better. The track is definitely visually smoother now, but I noticed I still hadn't fenced in the cave entrance yet, so we'll do that. I'll also change this staircase on the collision map to a ramp by deleting all of the steps and filling the two edges with a face. And just like clockwork, everything broke into a million pieces, and the fence doesn't work and the floor is a wall. And even if you get across it, Lakitu just brings you over the gap and stops you from completing the race. It turns out I never connected these two lap points, which is the source of that last issue. And raising this lap point here should let you glide across the path without going out of bounds. The fence and the wall are easy, just flip the normals and change the collision material. And now, despite the grass not having collision yet, this works pretty darn well. That means we can actually spend a bit more time making this look somewhat respectable. I can also set up a fence around the edges, and I decided to make a rock island thing in the middle to keep you from just cutting across it and skipping the turn. And I should also fence off this valley here. Now, when we race through here, it feels like an actual part of the track. Well, that's pretty good. In fact, you might be thinking we're pretty much done here. I mean, this is the track, right? And it's raceable. This is where I would have stopped on previous videos, but this time, we're making this thing legit. And the first thing we're going to do to bring this track to the next level is bring in some custom background music. And as luck would have it, I already have an absolutely awesome Castle Gardens track theme that Seberster made specifically for this project, which I am very grateful for, since otherwise this track would be playing Hyrule Circuit music the whole time, and that would have been a travesty. I'll leave a link to Seberster's channel where you can find this Castle Gardens remix. So now we can just drag in the MP3 file, right? No, unfortunately not. This is a new process for me, so I found a good tutorial and gave it a shot. So first, we need to make sure the audio is in the right format, being 32 kHz and having 4 channels. The first 2 are the song's left and right channels, and the last 2 are the left and right channels of the front-running drum track, which only activates while you're front-running. Then I need to convert it from a regular WAV file to the Nintendo Switch WAV format. We're also going to need a faster Final Lap version. On the first test, it didn't work at all. But after changing a few things, we got this.
What?
This is because I'm missing some kind of a fetch file that gets the beginning of the audio before it's fully loaded or something like that. But trying to get this fetch file to work caused the game to crash. The Track Studio Discord server helped me out on this. Apparently there's like a mod that makes this a lot easier. Like a modding mod. And with a little experimentation, it finally works. The music was too loud though, so I dialed it back in Audacity and reconverted it. Now we've got some great working background music that isn't just the Legend of Zelda theme being blasted over a very not Legend of Zelda track. And after widening out the bridge a little bit, I was sent a pretty awesome skybox on Discord. I won't be able to make full use of all of its crazy layers and maps, but the main layer turned out looking really cool. And with this new skybox, I feel like I should get those stars a-glowing. So to figure it out once and for all, I opened up Neo Bowser City and looked at how this track's emissive materials were set up. After copying all of the material settings over to the star material, I opened the game and sure enough, the stars are glowy now. Here's where we come up on the baking process. But first I'm gonna finally make a proper crystal texture. I got a decent blue scratched crystal texture made in Substance Designer, which ended up going through a lot of tweaks and upgrades. But this should be good enough to start baking. Which brings us back to where I am now. But what is this process like? Why does it take so long and why is it even necessary? Well, it's not. I can just have ugly lighting if I want, but the track already has custom music and a really cool layout, and it's pretty fun to race on. So yeah, it kinda is necessary at this point to do anything I can to improve the look of the track. So since rendering real-time lighting in-game is too taxing to handle at a steady frame rate, we need to set up the lighting and render it into a texture in Blender. Then that texture can be overlaid on our existing textures and give the track some nice baked-on lighting. The results should take this from a track concept to feeling like an actual course that belongs in the game. But it's not easy, or at least not fast. I have baked shadows before in Delfino Square, but I never baked the light maps for that. And apparently the way I baked the maps for that was way off and outdated, because now there's a new way to bake maps, one that's more intricate and time-consuming, but it makes much better bake maps, so I sorta have to learn this new method. I start the process the same as the old one, making sure each mesh has a second UV map called bake map, and that each material has a couple of nodes that will generate an image of the bake map that can be saved after it's rendered. Then I need to break down the model into bake groups, because I can't just bake everything into one image. There just isn't enough resolution in the bake map, which is at most a 4096 by 4096 image. Because let's say you're trying to bake a bunch of cookies in an oven. You can't change the size of the oven, but you can change the size and shape of the cookies. In order to ensure they cook evenly and don't end up sticking together, it's best to keep them consistently sized and spaced apart. You don't want 1,000 tiny cookie crumbs that'll just get incinerated by the heat. The smaller a mesh is on a bake map, the lower resolution it'll be. And if you aren't careful, you could lose entire faces if they're so small that they're smaller than a single pixel. It'd be a bit like trying to lay your now finished cookies out on some kind of a sieve and losing a bunch of small pieces through the holes. With 16 million pixels to work with in the 4096 square image, you wouldn't think you'd lose anything to the pixels. But if a mesh face is small enough and its details are fine enough, you can at least lose very important details that end up being smaller than a pixel. And if you tried unwrapping your entire track in one bake map, you'd certainly lose some faces to the pixels. So the game of bake maps is all about getting as much as you can to be as big as you can get it in as few bake maps as possible. I ended up with like 20, which is not good, but I had a lot of surfaces that demanded high resolution, meaning they had to be large on the bake map image, leaving less room for anything else in that bake group. Before even baking any textures, a few differences come up in this new method. There's a list of material settings to apply depending on if you're baking light maps or shadow maps and ambient occlusion maps, and even some different settings for nighttime and daytime courses. Luckily, there's a Blender add-on to help with some of that stuff, but I'll need to change material properties, hide or unhide lights, change the sun's behavior, and enable or disable ambient occlusion depending on the type of map I'm baking. Now the easiest way to do this is set the whole model up for light maps, get them all in one run, then switch it to shadow maps and grab your shadow and AO maps. But that's assuming that all of these bake maps have absolutely no imperfections and don't require me to come back and randomly grab different maps from random bake groups. And yeah, if you couldn't tell, that's what I've been doing. But the maps aren't done when they get out of Blender. They've got to be processed in Photoshop. For light maps, I need to apply 2 different surface blurs, then duplicate the image and do a black and white filter. Then I need to do a levels adjustment on that black and white layer, and add a background layer to the original colored image. After that, I need to copy this new black and white layer with the selection tool and make a mask on the original layer. Now I can alt-click on the mask and paste this black and white layer into it, thereby making a version of the light map that's got opacity that's tied to the brightness of areas on the image. And for the shadow pack maps, I need to drag in the ambient occlusion map first and make sure it's got a black background layer, which for some reason it sometimes bakes with and sometimes doesn't. Then I can do a shadows and highlights adjustment with these specific settings, which are supposed to work better for a nighttime track. Then I need to do a surface blur and bring in the shadow map, which also gets the same surface blur. Then I need to select the shadow map, copy it, go back to the AO map, black out the blue and green channels, and paste the shadow map into the green channel. I need to do both of those every time for each bake group, which is why I've spent 3 weeks baking maps. Tweak the model and the UVs, bake, process, import, looks kinda weird, do a whole bunch more baking. Turns out I had the normal maps unplugged, which are supposed to be active when baking shadows. Whoops, I had the skybox active for the ambient occlusion map. That's only supposed to be there for the light map. Uh-oh, I forgot to enable the emission on the stars and crystals for the light maps. You know, it's funny because I actually don't hate the process of setting up and baking shadow maps, and processing them in Photoshop isn't that bad. But having to wait 10 to 20 minutes per render and change all of the settings everywhere each time you switch between light and dark maps absolutely sucks. I was constantly redoing bake maps that had messed up in some way or hadn't been unwrapped well enough. And aside from these more specific rebakes, I ended up doing 2 or 3 full runs of the entire set of bake maps because I would end up changing something that affected all of the maps at once. But finally, after years, well, a couple weeks, I'm finally out. I finally have the bake maps in pretty good shape, and I have a very nice looking track to show for it. In theory, because it won't launch now, which is most likely because I have 20 bake maps which are each 5 to 15 megabytes. But you know what? We can figure that out. The important thing is, I've actually finished the bake maps and can now move on with the rest of the project. So in order to get these maps to not destroy the game before it even happens, I need to shrink some of them down. Actually, pretty much all of them as it would turn out, which isn't hard work or anything. It's as easy as re-exporting them from Photoshop at half or a third resolution. But that is so much resolution to lose on bake maps that I already don't have super high confidence in. Not only will it cause some shadows and light spots to be pixelated, but it could also really mess up the lighting on anything that's had its mesh blown into 1,000 tiny pieces on the bake map, which is exactly what happened to these small trees. But I mean, the resolution is mostly fine. It's really just the black spots that have shown up where we lost some data to the pixels, which means more unwrapping and baking and processing. And it actually launches now and looks pretty darn good despite the occasional glitchy shadows. The important thing is that it's basically all there and running in game now. But I need a break from all this baking, so let's have some fun placing some game objects in the map editor. I found a moon object and set it where the moonlight should be cast from, which worked great and looks pretty awesome in game. It kinda ties the lighting together in a way. I also placed a start gate banner on the castle gate that you start at, and I found some fountains which I think could look really cool sitting down in the water. Using some animated components like this is a good way to bring this track to life. But so much for that, because these fountains don't seem to work. So let's set down a few toads in the town area, and maybe even have one snorkeling down here in the water. Okay, no, that for sure was a mistake, but the other ones work fine. You'll notice the lighting on everything is too dark, which is something I can fix later. Oh, and you may have noticed that there are now star bits sitting around instead of coins or rupees, but unfortunately, after much deliberation, I couldn't find out how to make the star bits bright and colorful. They seem to be stuck being a sort of dark green color. After messing around a little bit, I found that the color of these star bits or rupees is actually tied to the main .szs track model, not any kind of lighting file or anything. So I'll just say that these are a new upcoming Super Mario Galaxy 3 feature called Dark Matter Star Bits. But hey, I just got an idea. I bet we can get those fountains working. I went on YouTube and found a gameplay video of Water Park, a track that I was pretty sure used this asset, and sure enough, there it is. So that means Water Park's particle effect file should contain the necessary effects for the fountains to work, effects that Hyrule Circuit's PTCL file doesn't contain. And since I don't believe I'm using any particle effects from Hyrule Circuit, I can just find Water Park in the game files and bring its particle effect file into the mod folder, which should now replace the Hyrule Circuit file file on launch. And just like that, the fountains are a-flowin'. And the starbits seem to have their particle effects too, which means that they're stored in a separate rupee game object file and not the Hyrule Circuit track file. Well, I think I'll scale those fountains up a bit and get the lighting working a little bit better on game objects and characters, which is a whole separate group of lighting. I tried making lighting areas, that way the lighting will change on your character when in the cave versus the town or forest, but for some reason the areas were stuck in their original spots. But I was at least able to adjust the lighting of those areas and make them brighter and somewhat consistent. Then I set up the enemy path, which is what the enemy bot racers take through the track. If you want to get one over on them, you could just tell them to drive right off a cliff, but I'm feeling generous, so I'll teach them how to actually drive through the track. I'd also like to fix the 0G section, because I guess it just stopped working all of a sudden without warning, but I'm really not sure what's wrong with it. Testing the track in versus mode, the enemy paths definitely worked, but the game crashes about halfway through the race. I haven't had a crash like that before, but maybe it was just bad luck or something. I'm pretty sure bad luck can mess with the game's performance a little bit, but I don't feel like worrying about that right now, so instead I'm gonna focus on something else that I noticed. The rupees do look like starbits on the ground, but the ones you pick up from an item box are still just rupees. So I searched around the game files and found a separate rupee model, which after replacing, did update the item box rupee. But I'm not a fan of the fact that all the item boxes make Legend of Zelda noises. I've never replaced a sound before, but I'm willing to bet it's similar to replacing the track music. So I found the track sound effect file, which contained the item box roulette and decide sounds. Then I went through some Super Mario Galaxy sound effects and found a couple that should work perfectly. So I converted them, replaced them in Switch Toolbox, and gave it a go. This right here is what it looks like when you change anything. It does this. If you want to mod a video game, you'd better be really hyped about this happening. I tried just about everything to get these sound effects working, but they'd crash the game every time they were supposed to play. So I went back to the Track Studio Discord and asked for some more help. I just want to thank the Track Studio Discord server and everyone who's helped me over there. I really appreciate that. As it turns out, you need to set the version number to 1.20 on the sound files. Yeah, I wasn't going to figure that out anytime soon, but it still crashes for some reason, which after some investigating turned out to be because you need to press this button down here to update your info after typing things. Why else would I type things in these boxes? For fun? Well, now that I've got all that figured out, we have this. For some reason, this was kind of the moment I realized how much more complete this track was than anything else I had made in this game. Like, the boxes, they don't usually make that noise. We're really starting to come up on the end of this now, but there's a few things I still need to fix, like those couple of issues with the bake map. Yeah, heck no, I'm not doing that. Let's fix this whole camera being underground at the beginning of the race thing. It seems like this intro camera menu is where you set that up, and I was able to kind of figure it out, but it wasn't working. So I checked Squadaloo's tutorial on it, and it turns out there needs to be 3 intro cameras set up, which did indeed work. But the cameras did look a little bit weird, and the game still crashes before you can complete a race. Eventually, I got those intro cameras looking a little bit smoother, and those item box star bits are definitely working, but the image in the bottom left and in the item box are still a rupee, which I feel like I can fix. I dug around some UI folders in search of the rupee images and came across a different file instead, the one that stores all the names of the tracks and other strings used in menus. And I was able to find Hyrule Circuit, which I replaced with Galaxy Castle Gardens. I also found the file that's got the course images as well, so I got my thumbnail render from my last video, formatted it correctly, and replaced the Hyrule Circuit image. Okay, the image worked, but what the heck happened to the track names?
Okay, Hold on. I messed a bunch of stuff up. Galaxy Gardens. Jeez.
Well, I'm not sure what that's all about, so let's just replace those rupee images. I was able to track them down and get some images made in Photoshop to replace them with. And bam, there's almost no signs that this was ever a different track. Oh, I also got the minimap replaced at some point. I don't even remember when I did that. Besides some areas of the bake maps looking terrible and the track not being finishable in a multiplayer race, this thing's just about done. There's one more set of audio tracks I want to replace though, that being the Hyrule Circuit intro sounds, which play during the 3 intro camera shots. So I got together a little collection of sounds from Super Mario Galaxy that I can use to make a simple soundscape for each shot. The first one's going to be some water sounds and some sparkly sounds. The next is going to be forest sounds and a few star bits falling down. Then the last one is going to be more sparkly sounds, along with the star sound that plays in Super Mario Galaxy when you're near a star. I feel like that's a good sound to end on, since you get a similar level preview in Mario Galaxy, which ends by showing you the star with that star sound. Alright, let's close in on those final few issues. I asked the Discord server about the text editing thing, and apparently you need a different software to edit the game's text. So I edited the text in that software, imported it to Switch Toolbox, and now we've got a properly renamed track. That crashes before you can finish racing on it, which turned out to actually be the easiest fix so far. Apparently, I just didn't have any item paths set up, so I generated them from the enemy paths with a single button press, and now it doesn't crash anymore. I realized that this was probably the case because it kept crashing right around when a blue shell would usually come out, which seems to require a path to even spawn without crashing the game. Now all there is to do is add some last little finishing touches, like fixing ugly spots in the bake map, like this weird Nike logo that appeared out of nowhere on the glider curve. I also had to fix the gravity paths, so I just deleted and regenerated them, which seemed to resolve whatever was the matter with them. Then I fixed this glider turn not going into the wall all the way and leaving this gap, and after a few more bake map issues were ironed out, we're done. Super Mario Galaxy Castle Gardens as a Mario Kart 8 Deluxe track. Here's what a full race on the track looks and sounds like. I'll have a mod page for this on Game Banana if you want to try it out yourself. I won't link it in the description, but it'll be there if you go looking for it. This has been a really awesome project, one that I feel like has reached a level of completion that none of my other mods or revamps ever have. And a huge part of that is the help that I've received, so I just want to say thank you to everybody who helped me make this come together, including all of you guys who gave me a good direction to take the track after the first couple of videos. And as much as I love this process, most of this process, I think I'll be doing something else on the channel for a while. Something a little bit closer to the style of videos that I used to make. I'm sure I'll be doing more stuff like this in the future, whether it's Mario Kart related or not. But I really miss just talking about fun subjects and not spending a month and a half on a mod before I can even start on the actual video process. So this video ends the same way as all of my other Mario Kart modding projects. That was fun, but I'm done. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed watching. I'll talk to you later. Thanks.